everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Insider's Guide to Audit Readiness, presented by Redica Systems and SIMCO Electronics. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please use the chat feature and we'll have a live Q&A at the end. With today, once we're done, I'll send out a copy of the slides, answers to any questions we don't get to, and a recording of the presentation. Before we begin, I would like to quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Taylor Minks, and I am the marketing lead at Redica Systems. Redica Systems is a technology company using data, analytics, and expertise to deliver meaningful insights to quality and safety professionals worldwide. By applying artificial intelligence to large and disparate government data sets, Redica Systems empowers its customers to improve compliance, increase product quality, and build a more efficient organization. Redica Systems was founded in 2010 and serves over 200 customers in the pharma, medical device, and food industries. Today's presenter, Jerry Chapman, is a senior GMP quality expert at Redica Systems. He writes the Redica Systems column, Conference Spotlight, and is working with our data engineers to build machine learning models for analysis of agency enforcement documents. He brings over 40 years of experience in the pharma industry, including 31 years at Eli Lilly in technical and leadership positions, and research and product development, manufacturing, plant quality, site quality, corporate quality, and quality systems. Our second presenter today is Sam Klooster, who brings over 15 years of experience in executive leadership, engineering, business development, and Fortune 500 companies and startups in his role as VP of SIMCO, Certerac software business. Currently, Sam leads the development of Certerac's software business strategy, managing the sales, marketing, operations, customer success, and product teams to drive innovation and growth. Sam joined SIMCO in 2016 and previously held positions of Vice President of Sales and Director of Business Development. Before joining SIMCO, Sam was Software Development Executive at Giovanni, a public sector big data analytics firm. Before that, he held strategy, engineering, and business development positions at aerospace and defense leader Lockheed Martin. Sam holds an MBA from UCLA, a master's in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, and a bachelor's in engineering from Hope College. And now I'll pass it over to Sam and Jerry for today's webinar.
Okay, so I am going to start by providing a little background here. First of all, welcome everyone who's in the webinar today. Appreciate you coming. In theory, the mission in our industry is really simple: make safe, high quality, great products and meet regulatory and business demands. But next slide, please. There are a lot of challenges to that. The growth in the number of regulatory agencies, for example, and it's not just the growth in the agencies and in the regulations, but in how they are enforced, right? How they are interpreted and enforced on inspection. So the question is, what are the expectations for your plant for you to be in compliance? And where do you find those changing expectations? All right, next slide, please. So you find them by mining enforcement data, right? You find them by looking at what did investigators find. We're focusing primarily on FDA here today, but it could be investigators from MHRA, EMA, other health regulatory authorities. So you find that information by looking at what those investigators or inspectors found when they went into a plant. Okay, what did they find? What ended up in the 483? What made its way all the way to a warning letter? So it's really time consuming. It's difficult to do that, and it requires a fair amount of expertise. And so to begin with, you have to have the data, right? So where is the data found? Well, at Redica Systems, we've built the largest data set of inspection and enforcement documents really anywhere in the world. And that's the data set that's going to be used for the analysis that Sam's going to give you here in a little while. So this data includes all FDA inspected and registered sites since 2000. It's 20 times more data than has been released on FDA.gov. How do we have more data than they've released? It's through targeted Freedom of Information Act requests. So FDA will post certain kinds of data to their website. If you know where to look, you can find it. But you can also get information. A lot of it's available if you know how to request it through the Freedom of Information Act. So we have information on more than 350,000 sites, 800,000 inspections. So that's a lot of data. But then once you get it, do you know how to analyze it? Do you have the experts to analyze it? And if so, do those experts still print hard copies and use highlighting markers to analyze them? I've done that in the past, and I know people still do. Right, print the hard copy, get the highlighter, go through and highlight what's really critical, what's important for us to focus on. What we've done at Redica Systems is built proprietary AI models. We call them expert models, using machine learning and some other tools that have been honed by industry experts. So to begin with, we'll talk briefly about where the data sources come from. All the data are from public sources. But an important point to keep in mind is that just because the data is public doesn't mean that it's easy to find, right? FDA has a lot of public data, but it's in a lot of different systems. Some are older, some are newer. They don't talk to each other, right? And so, there are FDA inspection databases, there are citation databases, we've got warning letters, we've got 483s and responses and EIRs. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We have site tags, so we can look by a particular FEI number, for example, what a particular site does, what it's been licensed to do. If you can click again there, Sam, there's one more box here. And so then how do we use all of this data, right? Once we have all this data, and we put it in a form that we can analyze and that we can relate to each other, talk to each other, so to speak. How do we use it? Well, we use it for a lot of different things. One, for example, is investigator profiles. So if you have not every, but if you have the most of the 483s that have been released, for example, and that you've requested that have been given since 2000, then you can look at those and find out, look by investigator, right? So you can say, what does this particular investigator, we've got maybe 50 inspections that he's done. What are the areas that he or she focuses on? What are their pet peeves? What do they look at? Right, so that's really valuable information to have, for example, when FDA shows up at your door. That's one way we use the data. We use it for due diligence, for looking at partners. We use it for a lot of different things. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. I'll mention that one other use, the one we're going to be talking about today, is for inspection preparation. So we'll go on to the next slide. So we've created, as I mentioned, this expert model. It's an AI tool that allows deep and rapid analysis of compliance data sets. We use a variety of different artificial intelligence tools. And what's really important is that besides having the tools, building the tools to use, that the tools have to be able to analyze the document, right? So the document has to be in a form that you can even analyze it rather than a hard copy with a highlighter, right? So on the next slide, what you'll see is that we've processed more than 50,000 483s, 43 responses, and EIRs. If you've seen those before or requested those from FDA, what you know is that they don't, for the most part, most of them do not have a text layer, right? It's like a picture, it's a flat file, and you can read it, but a machine can't read it, right? And so what we have done is put those into readable form. You can use optical character recognition, or a very reliable way to do that is actually just reading and retyping, and then proofing those so that now we can search them. They're not just a picture file anymore. In the next slide, you'll see that this is for an FDA drug GMP warning letter, and different documents have different structures. But the important point here is that the document needs to be parsed. And what that means is we need to divide it into its various sections. if you have a warning letter, for instance, or 483, there's a lot of information in there that at this point we don't really care that much about. So what can happen is if you don't parse it into its appropriate sections, then you could end up getting false positives in your searches. So we have something called the deficiency title, which in a warning letter is in bold and it references the CFR. That's the overarching issue that FDA has found. And then under that, it will say, for instance, or for example. We call that the deficiency description. That's where FDA lists what the investigator found that supports giving you this citation against the CFR. That's a really important section. That's where we find a lot of additional information that you don't find by just a simple Control F, right? It's information we call hiding in plain sight. And then you have, what is the action? What action did the company take after the inspection that probably wasn't sufficient, or they wouldn't be getting a warning letter, right? And then the feedback and the agency saying, here's what we expect you to provide us. So some of those sections are more important than others for the types of analyses that we do. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how important parsing is. If you, the results can be, what I've said here on my slide is worse than meaningless, which is true. It can be completely misleading with a lot of incorrect search results and drive the wrong actions and behaviors. If you're doing simple text searching, for example, if you did a Control F and the company was cited with 21 CFR 211.67A, and you're doing a search for keywords and you find contamination. So you say, aha, this company has a problem with contamination. They have contaminated products. That would be incorrect. It would send you the wrong direction, because this citation is actually about cleaning, maintaining, sanitizing, and sterilizing equipment and utensils, right, to prevent contamination. So the parsing is important, and keeping it in context is important. So we would not look at that CFR citation and search it. We would actually just map it back to the citation that's given, and then look at the specifically, or for example, text to get the really important detail. So next slide, please. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. These are some of the tools that we use to prepare the document. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that it's not just having the tools, but having the documents or the information in the correct format so that those tools can actually be applied to them. So once we have them in a readable format, right, a machine readable format, then there's still other things we need to do. Natural language processing includes text cleaning. So that's removing all the, what I say, junk out of a sentence, right? There are extra spaces, there could be typos, there's upper versus lowercase, and those can be confounding. Next slide. And then we do something called tokenization. So splitting the sentence up into tokens. The most basic of that is an individual word. Next slide. And then we do something called parts of speech tagging. And actually, when I was learning this, it took me kind of back many years ago to my days in junior high school. I remember in Mrs. Hilberry's English class, we were talking about diagramming sentences, and we had to diagram these sentences. And all I could think was, how am I ever going to use this? When would I ever care? What's the noun? What's the verb? What's the adjective? Right? And so what I'm finding now is here we are in the 21st century, and we're using what we used to call sentence diagramming, we now call parts of speech tagging, to identify the parts of speech in written text so that a computer can analyze it, because the computer can't read, right? So this is how you, these are one of the tools you use to analyze it. So how about that? Next slide. Then we also do something called stemming or lemmatization. They're similar to each other. Basically, it's taking different forms of a word and reducing them to their root. As authors write in different ways and different tenses, for instance, and so if you're searching for the word consigned, you're not going to find consigns or consignment, right? And those could be indicating the same thing. This is just one example. So we take it back to its root, which is also one of the tools that's helpful in this analysis. Next slide. Then we put together something that we call n-grams. An n-gram is just a continuous sequence of items or contiguous sequence of words. And so we have subject matter experts that create these, and these n-grams have meaning. So for example, the trigram, 3 words, your quality unit. That is a unit, that means something, right? Those 3 words together, your quality unit, tells us something. There are lots of those. And so with experience and looking through various enforcement documents, we've come up with these n-grams that our computer algorithm can use. Next slide. So we build the models, we apply the models, we actually organize these by FDA's 6 quality systems, and then we've added a 7th one. So we call it the 6+1 system model, the 7th being data integrity. It's the importance of data integrity in the last decade or more. We have models for human drugs, medical devices, and clinical trial investigators. So we can look at enforcement documents for those 3 different areas. And then we have some others that you see listed there that are in the process of being built. Each one has to have a different parsing model because they're not all parsed the same way. The n-grams are different depending on the topic, as is something called turbo EIR text, we can talk about if you like. And then we need to look at how all these things can be contextual. So for example, the word contemporaneous. When the word contemporaneous is used in a drug GMP warning letter, it is almost always used in the context of a second person verification or when something was written down. So in other words, you came back and wrote down this observation actually after it happened rather than at the time, right? It was your signing to that document or your adding of that information was not contemporaneous with when it occurred, right? In the GCP world, for clinical investigators, for example, they will use the word contemporaneous to say something like, you were running a clinical study contemporaneous with a hold that was placed. And so it's a much more general meaning, and certainly that's not a good thing, but it doesn't map specifically like it does in the drug GMP world, and it maps differently. So there's some nuances we have to take into account as we build those models. Next slide. And this is just an example of how we have built and applied these models and taken the various elements. So we can take compliance documents and look at where there are deficiencies that are being cited and map them to specific, not only quality systems, but subsystems, in many cases, subsystems, so that we can really hone in on where the issues were. Next slide. So with all the background I've just given you, we build the parsers, we build the models, we process warning letters or 483s using the natural language processing tools that I explained a few minutes ago. Then we run the algorithm, and then we look at the output, and experts grade that output and say, is this right? Is this wrong? Did the machine get it right? And if it didn't, why not? Why is it not right? Do we need to change the n-grams? We need to change the code. And we need to change something called fuzzy matching, where matching is not 100%, but it's close, right? And the percent fuzzy matching can have a big impact on the performance of the algorithm. So by doing this, we find secondary potential areas that are of concern. we will find the kinds of things that you would never find by a simple keyword search. And we call those hiding in plain sight. And Sam's going to talk a little bit about those. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we can use our data in a variety of different ways to support our mission, empowering the champions of quality and safety with actionable data intelligence. So we're going to go to the next piece here, the next part of the webinar. Sam Klooster from SIMCO is going to present some insights his company has discovered, working with our data and our systems, specifically related to Part 11 compliance. So Sam, turn it over to you.
Jerry, thanks so much for that background. Really interesting to see how you guys built the model and how applicable it is. What we're going to look at specifically today is how we can identify those pieces that are hiding in plain sight, specifically by looking at the human drug GMP model that Redica Systems developed. And the why I found this was so interesting, SIMCO has been a company around for 60 years, and specifically we focus on calibration service and software, and specifically delivering lean asset management software for regulated manufacturers. And what we're going to dive into again is the human drug model, but this applies broadly into, we could look at other models, like you mentioned, the medical device model, and see what the results are for that also. So SIMCO, we work with thousands of quality leaders really across the globe. We focus a lot on what we call the life sciences industry, so medical device, pharmaceuticals, and also aerospace and defense. Those are the leaders that really are worried about the quality of their products more than others. And ultimately, when we speak to them, about 90% of those quality leaders say maintaining compliance is their top challenge. And you can see that, why that is, when you start looking at the citations given out by the FDA. Ultimately, you look at a few examples here, right? Those citations can be across the board. They can be focused on in that first one, right? Written procedures not established, not followed, that clearly falls right within the quality space. The second one there, calibration of instruments, they're not done at suitable levels. Again, clearly falls under quality's responsibility there. And then thirdly, what we're actually going to dive into is spend time on is really the electronic records, that they don't meet the standards set there by the FDA. And so where are those actually records compliance regulations set? Well, it's FDA 21 CFR Part 11. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations that defines the regulations that governs business. And today we're going to focus on Part 11 because that's the electronic records and the digital signatures portion. That's where SIMCO software and other software systems play to make life easier for customers. There's been a lot written about 21 CFR Part 11, so I'm just going to give a brief summary, and then we're going to dive into some of the sections and then look at the data specifically from that human drug model of how it relates. So Part 11 took effect on or after August 20, 1997. That's when the regulations were put in place. And the regulations could have been interpreted very broadly by government. And so they provided industry guidance on the current thinking on the topic. One was established and published in August of 2003. And the reason they needed guidance is the interpretations could have driven the results of really three areas. One is the restricted use of electronic technology. Two, significant increase in cost of compliance. And three, actually discouraging innovation and technology advancement. Those are areas that are listed right in there, why they provided some of the thoughts on how they were interpreting it. And they also define, regulation state of when you apply it and when you don't. So for example, if you have paper in place, is paper validated? Can you use that? Well, what if you're using electronic records in place of paper? Or what if you're using electronic records in addition to paper, and that they relied on to perform regulated activities, right? Part 11 defines all of that. And you need to essentially have that documented within your standard operating procedures, your SOPs. And of course, there's substantial benefits for using an electronic system, things as reducing errors, increasing your data integrity, accessibility across your organization, faster information exchange, increase in cost savings. But there's also penalties if you're in non-compliance. Everything from the observations to warning letters to consent decree that ultimately can result in criminal penalties and fines. So there's 5 key areas that we're actually going to focus on today. System compliance, are the electronic system being used to store the records in compliance? Audit trails, are records kept, do you have the date, time stamped and version of those available? Electronic signatures, who can sign? What is the signature for? Are they validated? Access control, are the roles, permissions defined and controlled of who has access to the electronic system? And then system validation, looking at what is validation and the difference between validatable versus a pre-validated requirement. We ultimately have published a FDA 21 CFR Part 11 compliance checklist that we'll make available on the site after this, where you can go into and look at what are some of the key questions that ultimately you need to ask yourself about your electronic system or your electronic signatures as you're going through this. So I'm going to do that deep dive into each of these sections here. And so systems compliance, this is really defined in actually subpart B, and 11.10 defines electronic records. Also in the industry guidance and goes into detail on legacy systems and the criteria or expectations for those prior to August 20, 1997. I say that, but every year we go by, it's funny to look back to 97 and seeing what systems they might have in place. And I hope they've changed that since then. But going into compliance, right? Things like, does your system have workflows and can you enforce that compliance step by step? Can you control, limit, delete capabilities amongst who has access to them and what level? Do you ensure the proper sequence and steps that gets into, again, the workflows? Roles, permissions, can those be controlled at different levels within the software? Also, can results be altered? Get back to the previous one, right? And if so, who can alter those? And are they tracked and identified? And, is training provided? And is it documented? And ultimately, those who are responsible, do they have the right access and training? On the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot of what something that might look like, of who owns this, ultimately some of the calibration set points and procedures that use, right? Documented step by step of who has access and be able to control that. So when we dove into the expert model, again, this is the human drug model, and this is at the top level. I'm going to get a summary of all this, and then we're going to dive down actually into the individual sections. But we reviewed essentially 5 years of data, last 5 years of data, going back to roughly January of 2018 there. And ultimately, we compared what the expert model provided from results, and then actually did a rigorous keyword search. Because if you've been on the FDA website, right, you're looking at warning letters or such, that's really the way you have to do it. You have to type into the search bar keywords that might ultimately come up with matches. For example, validated, validate, things like that. Those are examples of rigorous keyword searches where you might come up with those positives. And what we found was, as a whole, those rigorous keyword searches, when you looked at the 483s, only provided about a quarter of the observations across the entire data set, the human drug model. And so really what that model, the expert model, provided is 75% of surfacing of 75% more of those observations. Really interesting to see exactly those pieces hidden in plain sight. So let's dive into some of those results. So for specifically system compliance, there are over 1,500 observations focused on systems compliance the last 5 years. You can see there 22% of those were identified by the rigorous keyword search within the expert model, but 78% were only identified by the expert model. Percentages will change depending on what we're looking at. And so you'll see the same setup and data going forward, and we'll summarize it at the end. One of the interesting things, again, you'll see this over and over again, is the impact of COVID. And so for systems compliance, that actually had observation decreased by 74% due to COVID. You can see actually it was on the rise there in 2019, and then 2020 hit and just dropped across the board. One of the other interesting things is I also took a look at, well, what's the breakdown between observations for US companies versus international observations? And in this case, this was actually fairly even. 55% were cited for US companies, while 45% were cited for international companies. And here's an example of specifically a warning letter. This one here given back in June 20 of 2019 that really focuses on systems compliance, right? This one specifically calls out, right, the procedures that they ensure requirements and those implemented to include record retention. They had issues specifically there. The nice part about here is searching with the warning letters. You can find these obviously right on the FDA website, but ultimately understanding the compliance in the 483s, that's what Redica provides. In SIMCOs, we're going to talk about obviously with our CertAct software, how we can help meet that compliance. So Audit Trails, you know, they're called out extensively in the industry guidance section published August 2003. They're also called out in part 11.10. And really, they reference a few things. One is, you know, are they secure? Are they computer-generated audit trails? Are they time-stamped? And, you know, are they anything that's created, modified, or deleted? Do you have audit trails for those? Also, you know, audit trail documentation needs to be retained. You know, specifically, it calls out for a period at least as long as required by the subject electronic records and be available for review. And so some of those questions, again, to ask, right? Are your time-stamped audit trail with complete histories? You know, do you have changes of history available? Where are they stored? Are they retrievable? Are they available to review? Device checks, right? Conform to source data valid. Evidence of system checks. And so here you can see on the right-hand side here, again, screenshot of example of an audit trail, a field audit log within the CertAct software, specifically keeping track of anything that's happening with this service event that was identified as an out of tolerance. So what does the data show? Well, 2,150 observations were focused on audit trails in the last 5 years. 25% of those were, again, identified by a rigorous keyword search, but we didn't come up with 75% of those. You know, 75% more were only identified by the expert model. And here you can see, again, increase of 2018 to 2019, and then that sharp decline, in this case, 65% decrease due to COVID. When you look at this international versus US breakdown, the observations were a little slightly skewed towards the US. 62% were cited from US companies, while 38% cited from international companies. You know, Jerry, as I was looking at this data, one of the things I kept asking myself is, well, you know, when do we expect this this level of observations to come back to your 2018, 2019 level? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Sam. So, I mean, FDA manufacturing inspections have ramped back up, but there was a really long time, you know, over a year and a half or so, where there basically weren't very many being performed. So what's happening now is the agency's playing catch up, right? And their highest priority are a couple of high priorities. One is for cause inspections. So there's a reason that they're to suspect issues, and the FDA needs to go in, so they'll focus their manpower on those first. And then there are the missed pre-approval inspections. So a company has paid, you know, GDUFA fees to get applications reviewed, And then they need a pre-approval inspection to get the product on the market. So they need to get those done. There are a lot of financial implications there. And then lastly, there are really a lot of international travel restrictions still in place. So India and China are a couple of big ones. As you know, India is really opened back up, but China is still really quite restrictive. So, the inspections are beginning to ramp up, but it's going to take a little while before those are reflected in the data.
Great feedback. Here's an example, International Trading Pharma Labs, right, given back in April 24th of 2020 there, and called out specifically, right, audit trails not enabled, so no way to determine whether the analysis manipulated the data. Perfect example, calling out audit trails there. Third one's electronic signatures, right? And so again, this is defined specifically in subpart C of part 11. Also, sections 11.100 and 11.200, and specifically goes into what's required, right? The name, the date, it's got to be signed, and the reason, right? Is it for approval? Are they the author of it? This so much actually gets into access and control, the next section too, but you can't falsify them. You can't cut them, copy, falsify them. You can verify the signature's identity, right? Can't be reused or re-signed. These are the questions that you need to ask yourself as you're looking at your software from an electronic signature standpoint. And so this one was two interesting observations for me. One is the fewest observations of all. There was only 300 of those that were identified as part of the expert model. But when you ultimately did that rigorous keyword search, you came up with 57%. So, nearly 2/3 of those were identified by the rigorous keyword search. And I think this is because ultimately, right, electronic signature or signature is a very straightforward keyword search that you can do across this. But we still missed some, right? 43% more were identified only by the expert model. And this split, again, is significantly higher than the other observations. You still had that decrease in COVID. Actually, the electronic signature started to decrease in 2019, which is actually different from the other models too. This one had one of the highest decrease, 73%. And this was cited almost evenly between US and international companies, with 49% US, 51% with international. Here's an example, again, Greenwave Analytics was called out in 2022 here, where they failed to validate their electronic signatures that they use for the testing. Access control is the fourth area here. And what's interesting, this falls under the electronic signature portion of 11.300. We called it out as its own section because so much of access to electronic signatures means, in this case, access to a software system. And so specifically, so much of it controls by the software, by the electronic records, calling out individual access to control to confirm the identity of the person, right? Do you have sophisticated passwords, security measures in place? How frequently are you changing passwords or making passwords expire? Do you have the right people, right procedures for recalling passwords? Authorized access. What if you attempt? Are you notified if people are attempting to access the system? Do you have procedures for if something's lost, right? Using a handheld device and that's lost, how do you control, or what is the procedure for that in the attempt you need to reset passwords? And that is tested regularly, right? That you're testing devices for the access and control. This one here, 13% actually. So this was 500 plus observations, and only 13% came up from a rigorous keyword search. While again, that expert model identified 87% more. This was the lowest number of keywords results across all the 5 sections. 71% decrease due to COVID. And this was actually most skewed, where you had essentially 71% were cited for US companies, while 29% were cited from international company standpoint. The FDA, so this tells me, right, is the FDA is really focused across the board, but really identified more challenges within the US than international. I expected that to actually be flipped, just when you read so much in the world about what's going on with some of the access and data access and hacking in other parts of the world, but 71% were actually cited within the US. And there's a perfect example, Vijan, down in 2022, appropriate controls over computer related to systems to assure that only authorized personnel can do the changes, right? And the fifth one is systems validation. And system validation, it's funny, it's covered extensively within the industry guidance. It's only listed once in the 11.10 controls for closed systems section of the actual FDA Part 11. But ultimately, there was a number of other documents written by the government to help customers understand what is validated mean, what is a validated system. And ultimately, it's essentially proving that you have the data to prove that the system does what it says it's going to do. So you run the tests. When you push the button, it's going to do what it does. There's a difference, though, between validatable and pre-validated. And so when you have a validatable system, that ultimately means that a software vendor might provide you with the documentation, the tests that you can go run yourself to validate the software system. This has to be done if you're using an on-prem installation, or you're changing out the servers, or you're upgrading the software. You have to go and revalidate the software. Versus a pre-validated system like CERDAC. Essentially, it's a SaaS-based platform that we host. It is pre-validated out of the box, FDA 21 CFR Part 11 and Part 820. We provide you that essentially documentation proving that, and that saves considerable time and money. When I speak with customers, they estimate they're spending 50 grand every time that they need to do a validation of the system between time and effort spent on that. And essentially, does the system validate go into, IQ, installation qualification, the OQ, operational qualification, and PQ, performance qualifications, right? You get the right results. When I looked at this, 28% were identified rigorous by the rigorous keyword search, while 72% more were identified by the expert model. And again, this one had a really high level. You see 2,000 observations were so focused on system validation in the last 5 years. Again, the drop due to COVID, 68% in this case. And this one actually was slightly skewed again towards US. 60% cited US companies, 40% cited international companies. This example here, you actually get a twofer if you read closely. This is a Colorful Products Corporation, May 10, 2022. This one came out, and you can see there in the highlighted section, first of all, I highlight software was not validated. And what I don't highlight is actually the second part, right? Lacked audit trails. This one would have been called out for both of those in that case, both validation and audit trails. So when you put all this data together, right? Over 6,000 times in the last 5 years, Part 11 compliance essentially has been referenced in these 483 observations by the FDA. System validation audit trails, they were actually observed the most frequent there, 33 and 32%. And you can't really see it well, but the electronic signatures was actually 4% there. That was cited the least. COVID caused, when you average across of these, a 69% decrease in the drug 483 observations when you put all this data together. So CERDAC essentially helps customers drive compliance without increasing costs. Purpose-built for highly regulated industries to do asset management. 16 out of the top 20 global life sciences use us today, 14 out of the top 20 aerospace and defense. 60 years of business, over 15 million services performed on the calibration service side of the business. We are compliant out of the box for e-signatures, workflows, and records. We are pre-validated, which saves that 50,000 every time you have to do this. And it's really designed for managing your quality compliance assets, your people, your procedures, with our different clouds, which are deployed across the platform. Highly configurable. I can't talk how much about that is a differentiator for our customers and easy to use, and it's secure and easy to access because it's a SaaS-based platform. So this is how we, SIMCO, are really helping to deliver life-saving quality leaner to our customers, both with our calibration services and our software. So with that, Taylor, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Perfect. Thank you both. We have quite a variety of questions to go through. So for starters, how would someone handle the management of an electronic data backup for the computer system?
Great question. So if it's an on-prem system, they're responsible, the customer is responsible for doing it themselves. And that's periodic backups, whether that's daily, weekly, monthly backups, or an annual backup. If you use a SaaS-based system like CERDAC, we handle all the backups for you. So we handle and do both daily, weekly, monthly, and annual backups. We also provide a cloud export solution that allows customers to download all their data and have one complete backup. So a lot of ways you can do that, both if you have an on-prem, you're responsible, or if you use a SaaS-based platform, your provider is responsible for that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Jerry, this next question is for you. What is the approximate time span of Redica Systems 483 data? The last 5 years, last 10, 20?
Yeah, we have data all the way back to 2000, although the farther back you go, the more kind of sparse it becomes. But we can easily do 20 years worth of data. It tends to be less critical. I mean, it less interesting, if you will, as you go too far back, right? We're more interested in current trends. So you can see what Sam did was they used the last 5 years. So we will typically use 5 years or frequently 10 years worth of data for our analyses, but we do actually have them all the way back to 2000.
Thank you. All right. Next question. You both probably have some insights on this. How would you handle and proceed if a key person is not available during a surprise inspection?
Jerry, you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been in that situation. So there are a couple of ways to do that. One is if you can get the person remotely, if they're not available on site, but they're available somewhere, right? I mean, maybe they're on the beach somewhere, but you can get them on the phone, then that's good. If not, then what you have to do is go to the next most responsible person, or the next in line, if you will. Yeah, when FDA shows up, you need to have the people there or some good representation.
Jared, that's a great answer. I think, we also see, just from SIMCO standpoint, being a third-party vendor supporting our customers with calibration services and software, where we get called often to help support FDA audits. And what it turns out to be something like, we can't find this certificate. They're asking for this piece of equipment, this certain day, time. It's not in the records. We can't find it in the paper filing cabinet. Can you, email me a copy? So we're regularly supporting customers with that on the service side. Or they're actually, the FDA auditor is asking them, how do you know your software is validated? Prove it. Prove your CERDAC software is validated. And we send over the FDA 21 CFR letter signifying that SIMCO validated the software. And then we have a third party, CCS, actually audit our validation every other time. So we routinely actually are supporting customers and helping them successfully pass FDA audits. some of our largest ones literally are doing this on a monthly basis because they have so many manufacturing sites. We're helping them successfully pass audits monthly with the FDA.
Thank you. This kind of spins off Jerry's comment of trying to get the right person on the phone. What are some mechanisms others have used to perform or support a remote inspection?
I would mention, if you go to our website, Redica.com, there is a section called Conference Spotlight that I write. And there are at least 3 or 4 pretty good articles there on remote inspections and the tools that agencies are using, tools that you can use as a company if you're going to need to inspect a vendor or supplier remotely. So there are a lot of tools to use. You can use real-time kinds of web-based tools. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's been written on that. There's a lot of reflection going on. At first it was, how can we do this, right? The various agencies and companies, how can we do this? And then as they began to experiment and figure out what worked well, then they began sharing those. And so there's some pretty good solutions out there. I hope that answers.
Yes. Anything to add, Sam?
No, you covered it, Jerry. That you have more experience in that sense than I do.
All right. Next question we have from the audience. What level of access or right of access is recommended for investigators and auditors to the GXP related systems?
Great question. You mind if I jump in here, Jerry?
I'll go right ahead.
So my experience when it comes to FDA or other regulatory bodies coming into audit is rarely do they actually provide the auditor with access to the software. They essentially set up a room for that auditor, and they essentially then have somebody understanding the question and going back and getting the data. So ultimately, if they're asking for certificates, they're asking for audit trails, those are printed out of our software, or probably others, and then brought into the auditor. And ultimately, that's how they're answering their questions. So typically, they don't provide access to the software for the auditor standpoint.
I would also comment that, and it goes beyond software access, but it gets into the realm of, for example, going into a sterile manufacturing area, or other kinds of manufacturing areas. People need to have appropriate training to go in there. They have to have appropriate training, and that training has to be documented. And an FDA or any auditor from another company or health authority inspector needs at once access to a system or access to a place inside your facility. Then they need to have the appropriate training and be signed off. And if you just say, oh yeah, well, they're from FDA, we need to let them go in, then you've just set yourself up for an observation, because you've allowed someone who doesn't have the proper training to enter an area they shouldn't be, right? So it's kind of a slippery slope to think about.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, next question. Are electronic signatures required by the FDA, or are 483s only for companies that are using electronic signatures incorrectly?
Great question. So 2 parts of that. One is, no, electronic signatures are not required. You can use paper and pen. Paper is considered validated by the FDA, so you don't need electronic signatures. And so companies, even if you're using electronic records, for example, you can print out, for example, a document that needs to be signed with a wet signature, date, right, purpose of it, and then scan and upload that to an electronic signature. And then the second part is, no, 483s are really observations across the board, not just for electronic signatures, but you could get 483 observations for anything. Actually, Jerry, I'd go over to you and say, what are, maybe some of the most common? We saw obviously some of the most common related to your human drug model here, but they're across the board.
Yeah, no, Yeah, good answer. Yeah.
Perfect. Kind of to spin off of that question, are software systems like Adobe eSign and DocuSign compliant?
First answer, we check with the manufacturer. That's the first answer there. Check with your manufacturer for sure. And what I would specifically ask is the proof, right? Ask for the proof of the validation tests, or ultimately that how can they support that if it isn't validated? That's where you have to go.
Gotcha. Okay, we have a time for a few more questions. Jerry, this one's more targeted towards you. What does Redica do with EIRs? Are they processed like the 483s?
Yes, they are. EIRs are not as readily available. And so an EIR, for people in the audience who aren't really familiar, stands for Establishment Inspection Report. It's kind of like a book report. It's the log or diary of the investigator when he goes on site. So what did I do? Who did I talk to? Where did I go? And then some subset of that gets put into the 483, and that subset would be the observations that the investigator thinks may be non-compliant. So we do have EIRs, but they're really a lot less valuable from the standpoint of looking at compliance issues than the 483s and warning letters are.
Okay, another question for you, Jerry. Does Redica have the ability to search CRL?
Yes.
Short answer, love it. All right, next we have a three-parter. So I'll go ahead and ask all three parts of the question and it can repeat as needed. What are typical priorities of FDA investigations during inspections? What are type of materials they generally expect to review? And are there specific expectations or requirements for the formats and media used?
Jerry, you want to start with that?
Yeah,
I got a little bit of insight.
Start with that. So when FDA comes on site into a manufacturing site, what they are looking for is evidence that shows that the drug is being manufactured the way that it's supposed to be. All right, so an application has been submitted and it lists technologies, it lists the way that the drug is made, and the investigator is trying to ensure that it's being made appropriately and according to good manufacturing practices. So one common sort of way to investigate that is to ask for example, a list of all deviations. When something goes wrong, there should be a deviation report that's written. And then that deviation says, here's what went wrong. Here's what we did to investigate it. Here's what we did to find the root cause. Here's the root cause. Here's how we fixed it. All right. And so that's one place they will look at the deviation log. I know it's really a broad question. I could probably talk for 10 to 15 minutes on it, but they're looking for compliance. Basically, you need to say what you're going to do what you said, and document it. And so that's what they're looking for.
That's a great answer, Jerry. Just like very specific on the calibration side, right? If you said, I'm going to calibrate this piece of equipment quarterly, well, they're going to look then for give me the last year of data. So I should see 4 calibration certificates once a quarter, and I should see that the sticker on the piece of equipment says it's still good, right? So that's some really specific examples of what you would say in your SOP or in your documentation, and some documents you would have to provide the FDA auditor to prove you did what you said.
Gotcha. Okay, we have time for one final question. Please type in any other questions you have and we can answer them offline and get back to you. So last question for today. For system validation, do companies need to revalidate periodically or only if something changes? Web-based software packages seem to update frequently. Does each update require revalidation?
Loaded question. The answer is it depends. And I hate to say it that way, but essentially the way that the FDA says you have to go through this is you do a risk-based assessment. You essentially look at what are what's the changes going on in the software, whether it was a patch, whether it was an upgrade, and you do a risk-based assessment to say, does this impact the quality system, the electronic records, again, in any way? And if so, then yes, you do have to go and do a revalidation. Again, on the on-prem side, if you're changing out the hardware, the server, or you're doing a massive update of your software, yes, you absolutely have to do a validation of that system again. If you're doing the vendors releasing a patch, again, that would be more of a risk-based assessment to make the call if you do have to revalidate or not, or portions you might have to revalidate.
Gotcha. Okay, well, that is it for today's webinar. Thank you, Sam and Jerry, both for presenting today. If attendees, if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot us an email or reply back to any of your event emails from the webinar. And we will see you at the next one. Thank you both.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.